journey through the faith with you. Come on, let's roll before your coffee gets cold. It's time for the JP2 Morning Crew.
Hey everyone, and welcome to JP2 Morning Crew here on JP2 Catholic Radio. Good to be with you once again as we come to you for another week of great programming here on JP2 Catholic Radio. I'm Brandon Clark, and I'm one of your hosts, and I'm joined by my co-host today, Paul Jonna, Special Counsel of Thomas More Society and partner at the law firm Lamandry and Jonna LLP. Paul, good morning. Thanks for joining me today.
Good morning, Brandon. Great to be with you. Thank you.
You know, we have an important discussion this morning. We'll introduce our special guest in just a moment. But, you know, we've had lots of conversations with you as a guest over the past couple of years just about religious freedom and, you know, what it looks like to protect our First Amendment rights. Anything that you want to say about that, just to kind of set the stage for our discussion today?
Yeah, so I've had the great privilege to be working closely with Jeff Trissell, our guest today, for over 10 years now. He joined our firm in 2014, and a lot of the battles, actually pretty much all the battles that I fought here at this firm with Chuck Lamandry, I've worked hand in hand with Jeff Trissell, and he's a brilliant lawyer, and it's been amazing to see him grow as a lawyer and to see the great work he's done, and he has played a very serious and significant role in winning a lot of these battles, and excited to talk about his book and the cases that are covered in that book, which are probably the most significant battles that we fought here in our firm.
Yeah, and that book that Paul was mentioning is Unlocking the Churches, which is a history of the religious liberty lawsuits, specifically during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's go ahead and welcome in Jeff Trissell. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning.
Hey, so we've got a lot to cover here, but before we begin, we always invite our guests to lead us in a prayer, just setting us, you know, at that spiritual piece as we begin discussions. So, do you mind leading us in that prayer?
Sure. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast in hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls.
Amen. And the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. That is a great prayer, obviously, as we consider, you know, everything that we're doing here through Catholic Radio, everything that you guys are doing, you know, in working to defend religious liberty. We know there are many spiritual battles. So I love that you picked the St. Michael the Archangel prayer to lead us off with. You know, my first question here, Jeff, is, you know, this is a topic that has drawn, you know, a lot of ire from people. It's a pretty sensitive subject in talking about the closing of churches during the COVID-19 pandemic. So why did you pick this topic to write a book about?
So as Paul said, I've been working in religious liberty for 10 plus years now, and a lot of the cases sometimes seem more political. They don't necessarily strike at your heart, your core as much. But when the church closure cases came up, those ended up being very personal to me. Like Paul said, I worked around the clock on those cases for a full year. That was my entire practice, essentially, including overnight brief writing, which I had never done before. You know, it's like, as much as I love my clients, I had never before been motivated personally enough to write a brief overnight. But when they said you can't go to Mass, well, that was enough for me.
Yeah, Jeff, and I remember being with you during a lot of those moments, and it was incredible the amount of work that was put in, thousands and thousands of hours, multiple different cases. Tell us what was the most miraculous thing that happened during that year?
Right. So the book basically details the history of our cases, right? Because we had the most impactful cases in California with trips to the U.S. Supreme Court. But I also wanted to document all of the lawsuits filed nationwide, 50 plus lawsuits, and discuss their histories. partly because it was such a crazy year. And to me, the most impactful thing, the most miraculous thing was that we kept Pastor MacArthur out of jail. Right? So there were not that many prosecutions in America, right? There was lots of lawsuits by churches seeking to open, but in other parts of the country or other parts of the globe where churches did just open, they got prosecutions from the government. And in America, there were not that many. There were 3 in California, one of which we defended, and it was because Pastor John MacArthur, who recently passed away, decided to lead. He decided to open up his church, announce publicly that he was opening up his very large church, and put a target on his back in the county of Los Angeles with all of their resources, 10 million person county, bigger than 40 of the states, decided to come after him. And I was very afraid Pastor MacArthur would be going to jail. I did not know how he would keep him out of jail.
Hey, Jeff, I think it would be interesting for the viewers and listeners to hear about that story when we actually went down to court together and had to wear masks and argue for Pastor MacArthur. Why don't you tell the viewers about that day?
So the way the book is structured, it's structured into 3 parts. And the first part is our initial push to open the churches, including our 5-4 loss at the U.S. Supreme Court in May, which we then eventually got reversed. But between the period when we got that loss at the highest court in the land, there's no other place to go once you go to the highest court, then we had a summer of what for me was a very depressing summer, including an aggressive prosecution by the County of Los Angeles that I didn't know how we were going to win because we already lost at the U.S. Supreme Court. And so Paul and I had to drive up to L.A. County from San Diego, a 2-hour drive, which was, the highways were completely empty because it was everything was locked down still, pretty much. Go to the courthouse, and it was eerie, right? It was so empty. There was hardly anything going on, but you did have to wear masks. And then, I recall on that drive just being very pessimistic. But as Paul said, he made a brilliant argument, convinced the judge not to rule against our client on an emergency basis, ordering Pastor MacArthur to shut his church. And we celebrated. It was the very first win of any kind on these lawsuits in California that we immediately got reversed in less than 12 hours by the Court of Appeal. But we got a win for 12 hours.
That's great. Obviously then, so this, you got that win for 12 hours and then, immediately, gets reversed after that. I mean, just talk about the battle from a religious freedom standpoint, Jeff, in seeking to get our churches open and just how hard it was to get the churches back open, to have the people be able to attend religious services.
I think it was really about convincing people that churches shouldn't be closed, right? Which is a weird thing. But when the very first lawsuits were filed in late March and early April, and those were not lawsuits we were involved with. I think for the first 6 weeks, the attorneys in my firm, Paul, me, and Chuck, were kind of thinking we should trust the bishops. The bishops decided to close mass. We're all going to be in this together. But then by early May, we were looking at what Governor Newsom was doing in terms of reopening other industries and thought, well, this is very discriminatory. He's giving churches short shrift, not because they're riskier than other industries, just because he doesn't think they're particularly important. But then we still had to convince lots of other people. I mean, we couldn't get the Catholic Church to join our lawsuit, so we ended up representing Bishop Hodges of South Bay Pentecostal Church. And in May, especially May 2020, it felt like people really didn't support us as thoroughly as I thought they should, perhaps because they weren't watching the news and watching how the discriminatory reopening was actually happening. And then throughout the summer, it became more and more difficult to convince people that reopening was actually the right thing for churches, and that it was actually it became easier and easier as more and more people viewed it as kind of common sense that churches shouldn't be closed. But even by that point, the courts were not with us, and so it was an uphill battle.
I got a quick comment and then a question for you, Jeff. But the comment is, as far as miracles, there probably were more than one, because you mentioned keeping Pastor MacArthur out of jail. But how about the change in the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court right in the middle of all this? I mean, that was miraculous too. So you might want to touch on that. And then I just want to also give you a chance to tell everybody a little bit about yourself and what these cases mean to you personally.
So the third part of the book, as Paul prefaced, basically starts with the change in the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Ginsburg passes away. She's replaced with Justice Barrett. And that is enough to get the jurisprudence in this area changed. Now, that obviously was a very impactful change that impacted not just the religious liberty for COVID, but it impacted religious liberty generally. I mean, now that we have a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, things are definitely going in the right direction. But that wasn't, necessarily the only thing that resulted in the ultimate win, right? I think one of the points I stress in the book is that case that got the first Supreme Court victory, with Justice Barrett helping turn the jurisprudence in the right direction, that was a case brought by the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn. And I think it was a wake-up call to the justices that even the Catholic Church is now saying enough is enough. I mean, because obviously the Catholic Church, being such a big institution, does not turn on a dime and generally is quite respectful of the federal government because of how much federal money is flowing to the Catholic Church through the immigration programs, etc. And when the Catholic Church basically said, okay, what you've done is too much, we're not going to be partners with you anymore, then I think that really helped move the ball. And I wish the Catholic Church had done that earlier, that they'd woken up earlier.
Yeah, and then just that second part then that Paul had asked Jeff, what do these cases mean to you personally, as you were in the process of litigating them, right? But then now, as you look back, almost 5 years later, and now you've written this book as a result.
The cases are complicated, right? There's lots of deep thoughts. Everybody has their own unique thoughts regarding COVID. That's why I kind of wanted to wait 5 years before publishing the book, is because I think a lot of emotions have been raw regarding COVID for a very long time. And obviously, we all lost somebody. I mean, the World Health Organization estimates 17 million excess deaths. I lost somebody, an elderly family member who lived with me was one of those excess deaths. And we got to be cognizant of the pain that the pandemic itself caused, while also recognizing that the lockdown itself caused a lot more pain. And I think that pain also ends up leading to good introspection. So as a lawyer, I'm trained as a religious liberty lawyer. The book is primarily about the history of the lawsuits, with particular attempt to make the story readable to the average person. I mean, obviously there's legal thrillers out there you can read, and the authors do their best to make the story compelling for the average person who's not legally trained. And that's what I did here. But I also didn't want to publish this as a legal journal article because I included a lot of spiritual commentary that was very important to me. What lessons can we draw from the pandemic and from the closures, from the church's failure to push back as strong as it probably should have. And to me personally, the best.
Hey, Jeff.
Go ahead.
No. I'm sorry. Please.
The most important thing I think the pandemic caused for people is, it seems to me to be causing a third great awakening. Obviously that's maybe a little bit much to say, but I do think that we're seeing a new dawn, because people and the government saw that they discriminated against religion too much and needed to pull back, and that we're all saying, we're all seeing that we can't just discriminate against religion in to that degree.
I didn't mean to cut you off there. There was a little bit of a delay, but as far as lessons go, I'm curious what you make of the fact that there was, as you noted, a Supreme Court victory on this issue out of New York, but yet our cases were continuing here in California, and in California, it took multiple additional trips to the Supreme Court to get them to finally, comply with the law, and only after there was a court ruling striking down the indoor worship ban in California. So I'm curious what lesson you take away from that experience of our local state here, California.
So as a devout Catholic, I often take for granted many of the things that the church teaches, right? The fact that the sacraments actually confer grace, that religion is not just all spirituality, that socialism and agnosticism are self-defeating philosophies that make very little sense, and that you don't have to be particularly intelligent to figure that out. But I forget that many Americans, especially Californians, actually believe things that I take for granted are absurd. And I think that this was a wake up to me. I mean, reading some of the opinions from the judges, then in the Ninth Circuit in response to our lawsuits, really showed how foreign the way of thinking is of modern America and modern man to the timeless truths of the church. And it just reminds you that you can't be of this world, right? You can live here, but this is not our home. I mean, and it's fascinating to think like what it would be like to be a judge and have to be surrounded by people who actually believe pretty, I think, incongruous ideas about reality, anthropology, our relationship with God.
Yeah, just to remind our listeners here, this is JP2 Morning Crew here on JP2 Catholic Radio. We're visiting this morning with Jeff Trissell, who is a civil litigation attorney at the law firm Lemandry and Jonna LLP. He also serves as special counsel to the Thomas More Society. And what we're talking about this morning, he authored the book Unlocking the Churches, which is a history of the religious liberty lawsuits during the COVID-19 pandemic. Jeff, I'm curious to know, just with this book, what is your hope for it? Are you hoping that it's a rallying cry, to have people more vested in religious liberty battles? Are you hoping that it serves as like a lesson in history of where we don't want to go again? Like, as you've now written this and now waited the 5 years, now that it's out, what are you hoping comes of it?
My inspiration for the book really was Peter Kreeft. Now, if your listeners know, Peter Kreeft is a philosophy professor on the East Coast who is sometimes scoffed at in the academic world because he doesn't publish a lot of journal articles. But he doesn't need to publish journal articles. He's published 100 books. But the books are largely written for the average Catholic, trying to help the average Catholic learn more about philosophy, learn more about their faith. And that was my inspiration. I think in a certain sense, this legal history could have been a legal journal article, and it would be a very, I think, well-received journal article. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make it accessible to the average Catholic so that they can see how our legal system works and understand just the story. Because I think there's a lot of spiritual lessons to be drawn from the story. Secondarily, I wrote the book kind of like a novel, right, with suspense, and it's a history of 1 year, but it's not really a history necessarily. It's more of a story. And so I hope people just find the story fascinating, because I did. There were lots of up and down. Things changed very quickly in terms of judges issuing crazy rulings that were very results oriented, getting reversed the next day, getting reversed the next week. Then the landscape changing with the new Justice Barrett, with executive orders changing from week to week. There was a lot of curves in this story.
As a funny aside, I will say that the author whose writing I read the most of nowadays is Jeffrey Trissell. He drafts a lot of the briefs here, and I spend a lot of my time reviewing them and editing them, and there's not lots of editing that needs to happen, but he's a very, very good writer, and I think he's done a great good by documenting, for all to see what happened with these 3 cases over this period. And so I really encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book. Hey, Jeff, another question I get all the time, and I'm curious what your response is, because I'm sure you've thought about it too. People always say, well, can this ever happen again? Do you ever think Mass will be withheld from the faithful again? What's your answer to that?
I think it depends on what happens in the next 20 years. So I think the average American, the average Catholic, will not let anything happen in their lifetime. If the government attempts to shut down the churches again in the next 10 years, I think the vast majority of people will just say no, and the government won't be able to do anything about it. But I also fear that memories are short, and that our next generation or the generation after that, if we have a pandemic in 100 years, well, who knows what will happen. And in that respect, I hope that the memory of the church is longer, and that the bishops tell the next bishops to remember what happened during COVID and to never shut the churches again. And that's one of the lessons I think that we can draw from one of the stories I tell in the book is about St. Thomas More and Bishop Fisher, which, if you recall, Bishop Fisher in England was the only bishop who protested the king's takeover of the church. And he was martyred for it. And we recall that history and that example. But what we don't recall, and we don't usually talk about, is that 100 years later, or not quite 100 years later, but many years later, after the king's daughter became the new queen and she tried to reinstate the Catholic Church, but failed, then all the bishops that she appointed, the vast majority of them went to their death in the second takeover of the church. They were inspired by Bishop Fisher and said, we're not going to let this happen a second time. We're going to fight. We'll go down fighting. And so I think hopefully this example can inspire, the bishops 50 years from now, that if there is another attempted lockdown, to say no.
Yeah, I just want to back up for one sec and ask this question. Why do you think we, in the first place, were so readily to accept the governmental shutdown of churches and the determination that essentially worship was not essential?
Well, I think the answer for everybody is unique, obviously. I think for me personally, I wanted to trust the bishops. We've had enough scandals in the Catholic Church, from sexual crimes to financial crimes, that sometimes it's not always easy to trust the institutional church. But for me personally, I think that's one of my strong desires, is to trust the bishops. And so when the bishops said we're going to shut down Mass, I said, okay, I'm going to trust my bishops. I think for other people, I fear that the issue is more about not really believing the incarnational theology of the church, that sacraments are actually necessary for salvation, that sacraments actually confer grace, and that you cannot have sacraments remotely. They don't work. But they actually do work ex opere operato if you're in person receiving the sacrament. And I worry that might have been the lack of faith might have been present not just in the faithful, but in the clerics. But at the same time, we've had crises of faith in the church before, right? Like the Arian crisis, right? The 4th century, the majority of bishops denied the divinity of Christ, but that didn't stop the church, right? And so even if we have a crisis of lack of faith in the church, where the bishops basically felt compelled to shut down mass because it wasn't that important and they receive a lot of federal funds, well, the church will keep going.
Jeff, I have another similar kind of foundational question. I'm curious if you have a thought on this, which is a lot of people ask, why did governors do this? What was motivating them to shut down churches or to deem them not essential? Do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think it's a mixture of hubris and growing bureaucracy. I mean, I think the hubris of modern man that we're always in the pinnacle of civilization, the pinnacle of intelligence, that we're moving in a positive direction, always getting more and more knowledge. I think that's a silly philosophy. I tend to think of history more as a wandering, right? Like we wander this way, we wander that way, not that we're climbing a hill towards perfection. But, a lot of people still have that strange philosophy from the 60s that we're getting better and better. And then we have bureaucracy, right? Which is when we have so much bureaucratic overreach, each one in their little silo, they think, well, if I'm the public health director and now I'm in control of the whole society, we're going to do what we do from public health perspective, which is quarantine. I know how to do that. But the public health director really doesn't know anything about economics, doesn't know anything about logistics, and ignoring those fields because you're in your silo of public health is easy, but it's a careless exercise, and it led to, I think, a lot of harm.
One other really quick, I'm sorry, really one other thing on that note about experts, and I know this is not covered in your book, but I just wanted to bring this topic up, which is, earlier in the pandemic, everyone was told, trust the science, trust the experts. And a lot of people fell for that. And now I think we're seeing the tide shift recently with gender affirming care, so-called gender affirming care. The Supreme Court has sort of hinted that, the experts are not always right. And we don't need to trust the medical establishment. So I'm curious if you have a quick take on that. I know we're running out of time, but as far as whether there has been a shift in the way the courts have looked at deference to medical experts.
So I think it's a little bit actually unfortunate that we're unwilling to trust the experts anymore. As a general proposition, I think that we can learn a lot through very careful science, very careful logical reasoning, and we can know a lot. The problem is that things get infected with politics, with philosophies that don't make any sense, and the experts try to pawn that off as real science, real logic, real reasoning, when it's clearly not. I mean, the reasoning behind the gender affirming care and the gender ideology is just really, really bad anthropology. But the response to that can't be that we no longer trust the experts on anything, which is where we're going. And it's a very postmodern kind of way of thinking that we can't know truth because we can't trust the experts. Well, we can know truth. We just got to be careful what experts we're trusting and whether they have a bias and a motive. But I think the courts now especially seem to be much less impressed by titles and want the actual reasoning underlying the theory to make sense. And that's hopefully a good move.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for being on with us today. To our listeners, you can pick up the book. You can find it at crisismagazine.com. Look for Unlocking the Churches. You can find it on sophiainstitute.com as well. Also, just look for Unlocking the Churches. And then if you're an Amazon person, you can go right to Amazon as well. Type in Unlocking the Churches by Jeff Trissell. It's been a great and fascinating conversation, and love to have you on again and continue the conversation, because I'm sure there's much more we can unpack.
Yes, sounds good. Hopefully I'll have another book before too long.
Sounds great. And Paul, thank you for joining me as my co-host today. Always value your insight and how you just add so much to our conversations.
My pleasure. It's always great to be with you.
And a reminder, if you missed any of today's show, you can head to our website, jp2radio.com. Just look up the Morning Crew podcast under programming. You can find it there. We're also available on YouTube and Facebook if you want to watch today's show. We bring you JP2 Morning Crew every Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific, with an encore on Friday at 9 a.m. That, my friends, brings us to the end of today's show. Up next, it is Life is Worth Living with Archbishop Fulton Sheen. We'll see you again next week. God bless.